Hi, everybody. Welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. I'm so glad that you could join us today. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, an independent press that publishes historical novels. And What's New in Historical Fiction is a regular panel series that we run that features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. I'm really excited about this panel today and to bring you these new novels and to have this discussion. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. Right now, you can toggle your cameras on or off. It's totally up to you. I do have the mics disabled for the moment, just to make sure that we don't have any distractions. But you can toggle those on and off once we get to the Q&A. Please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from. Let us know what novel you're currently reading. Maybe you've already picked up one of these panelist titles. I also want to post a link to our panelists' titles, which is on a landing page on our website, and they are all linked to bookshop.org. We support bookshop.org and buying books from them because they give a portion of their sales to us as an affiliate link, but also to a bookstore, an independent bookstore of your choice. So check that out. I'll post the link again later in the panel. Okay, I'm going to exit the screen so then we can introduce our panelists. So let's begin with our good friend Fenech, who's already done several things with us, and she's republished her novel, Eight Pointed Cross. hi.
Hi. First of all, just want to say it's such an honor to be here alongside these wonderful authors, and I'm just so appreciative that you've included me, so thank you so much.
Could you just tell us a little bit about your novel?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so Eight Pointed Cross, which just arrived, is the first novel in my Siege of Malta trilogy. It's set in the 16th century Mediterranean world during the decades that led up to the Great Siege of 1565. It follows several interconnected characters from Malta to Turkey, with a few stops in between. And these people's lives are shaped by the growing conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Knights of St. John, who made their base on Malta without the consent of the Maltese. And although the story unfolds against major historical events, the heart of it is just the way ordinary people navigate faith and loyalty, family, betrayal, and survival when history places them on opposing sides of an empire-shaping war. So my hope is that the story makes you root for people on both sides of the battlefield.
That's definitely hard to do.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mar. Next we have Laura. And Laura, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask how to pronounce your last name.
Vogt.
Vogt, okay. And Laura is the author of In the Great Quiet.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is really fun. I'm very excited to get to know everyone. And so my book, I grabbed mine, it's In the Great Quiet, and it's inspired by my ancestor. And she ventured into the Oklahoma frontier in the 1890s, and she was a homesteader. And so it's a Wild West story. There's a romance, and it's following her venture into the frontier. And I like what you said more about like everyday people. I was interested in it because she does like really exciting, tenacious, like ballsy things. I love a story of a very strong heroine, but she's also just an everyday woman. There's nothing really that remarkable about her. She would not have made a footnote of the history books. She just is someone that's kind of forgotten. And that is what all my stories are kind of finding, like those women on the fringes. I love the everyday stories. That's kind of what really drew me into it, was to kind of settle into what it would have been like for her. And she is inspired by my ancestor.
Yeah, I think that's amazing to be able to write a story about your own ancestors like that. Yeah. That's wonderful. Next, we have Natasha Lester joining us all the way from Australia. Natasha is the author of Chateau on Sunset. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Let me just grab my book. Sorry, very disorganized there. I was just saying earlier, I'm coming to you guys from the future because it's Wednesday already in Australia. So it's always lovely to be a little step ahead of everybody else. My book, The Chateau on Sunset, is a reimagining of the Jane Eyre story set at Hollywood's infamous Chateau Marmont Hotel during the 1950s and the 1960s. And similarly to Laura and Ma, the main character Aria is just an ordinary 14-year-old girl when we meet her. And it's about her journey to become a young woman who finds her voice in this environment where everybody wants to be seen because they're a Hollywood starlet. But Aria begins life not wanting to be seen. So, and I'm also trying to resurrect some of the forgotten women of Hollywood and bring their stories back to people's attention.
Thanks, Natasha. Yeah, a lot like what Laura's doing there. And finally, we have Olesya Gilmore, and Olesya is the author of The Fortune Tellers of Rue Daru. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and in great company. So yeah, my book is, oh, I can't really, it's kind of blurring it out, but it's kind of here, The Fortune Tellers of Rue Daru, which is, I guess it's about a kind of a normal girl, but she has some power. So I write speculative Gothic fiction. And in this book, it's a multi-generational tale. And it's about a fortune teller. She's a young woman named Zina. And she is living in Jazz Age 1920s Paris with her grandmother, who is also a fortune teller. And they live in this Russian community that was very prevalent, very robust at the time, living in the 1920s. These were people who had fled Russia after the 1917 revolution. And so they own a tea room / fortune telling shop and a seance parlor on a real street in Paris called Rue de Rue. And they must kind of delve into the secrets of a very dark past of their family when a certain Romanov princess and her brother come to them seeking answers about a very old murder that happened in their tea room. And it basically threatens everything these women have built in immigration, in Paris, and of course each other. So it's about women in immigration. It's about women being breadwinners in the 1920s, Paris kind of Russian community. And it's inspired about my own immigrant experience. I'm a Russian immigrant living in the States, but I wanted to write about people like me, but in a different time and place, which makes me interested. And so it has a lot of that, and also the central relationship between my main character and her grandmother, which is inspired by my relationship with my beloved grandmother.
Oh, that's wonderful. Another family connection and just a fascinating history that I didn't even think much about. 1917 Russian Revolution and people resettling elsewhere. Well, let's go back to Mar. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for saying hello in the chat and letting us know about some of the books you're reading. If you have questions throughout the panel, post them in the chat. I'll do my best to get to those. We'll definitely get to a Q&A here towards the end. Mar, tell us a little bit about Malta, your connection to Malta, and where it sat politically in the 1550s when this book takes place.
For sure. So I am Maltese by heritage. I spoke Maltese even before I spoke English. And I grew up immersed in the language and the culture and its really rich, layered history. My parents were such storytellers, so they really immersed me in the culture from when I was quite little, and that sparked my interest. So writing about Malta, it wasn't just like a great setting or a good excuse to travel there to research. It was personal. Geographically, Malta's tiny island that sits at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. So it's kind of like a stepping stone to mainland Europe, which meant it was constantly occupied by foreign powers. And then on top of that, the Renaissance was in full swing, but Malta was still kind of mired in the Dark Ages. And it was on the verge of the Roman Inquisition. So it was quite a tumultuous time. The 1551 Ottoman invasion, which is the culminating event of Eight Pointed Cross, served as a turning point because it really revealed how vulnerable the island was and how poorly defended and how ill-equipped. And And then that set the stage for the Great Siege of 1565. And what really fascinated me was just the resilience of the people, because that transcended, like, the Maltese people weren't just resilient in the 16th century, but it carried on right up into like World War II. They just have this grind, carry on resilience. And just to kind of research and to see how in the 16th century they just continued living their lives in the shadow of just this extraordinary danger and constant threat of corsair raids, again, looming Inquisition, threat of scarcity, famine, even tornadoes, and they just carried on. So that the human experience really did become the foundation of the story. And my closeness to the culture and being Maltese really informed a lot of my characters and their development, because I could just pull from my own experience being Maltese, having Maltese family members, visiting the island, pretty much growing up there, attending school and getting kicked out. So, it's just deeply ingrained in me. And, getting to read this story that not a lot of people know about, like the Siege of 1565, it really did shape an empire, and yet so few people actually know this story. And to me, it's like this amazing underdog story that I thought, I think people need to know this story, so I'm going to tell it.
I think that's great, and I love that all of you have such personal connections to your stories. Speaking of which, Laura, let's talk about Minnie. Who's Minnie based off of, and then tell us more about the historical context in 1893 in the Oklahoma land rush, was it called?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's based on my grandmother's grandmother. She was a homesteader in the 1890s frontier, and I think that's actually been really fun. I grew up in Oklahoma, so we talked about the front land run, and it's a very fraught, complicated, kind of awful history. So I have a historical note in the very beginning of the book to kind of set that up. But it's been fun that some people have never heard of it. So if you have not heard of it, the land was open for people. It was literally a race, and that is very, again, with it's kind of the Oklahoma spirit. So they had a race, and whoever got to land first, they could they could own it. So my ancestor, she did this, and so it's based on my grandmother's grandmother, and it's inspired by her. My grandmother had stories, and she knew her grandmother, and I found some texts, and I went to the actual plot of land, and so I kind of was able to kind of piece together kind of personality traits and maybe some choices she made, but the story is mostly inspired more and based on historical research. So there was a lot of interviews and first person accounts, so most of my research was actually just kind of cobbling together what other choices other women made. So it is inspired by my ancestor, but it's not like a biographical story. So if you read the story, you're like, oh my goodness, did Laura's ancestor do XYZ? No, I don't know. So a lot of it is it's historical fiction, but it is very much inspired by that kind of the Oklahoma spirit in my family as well. So
are there any oral histories in your family that you weren't sure if were embellished or not? That
absolutely. And my grandmother, her personality, she's very like reserved, so she doesn't actually elaborate that much. My grandfather did, but she did not. So she but there was she told stories, and I found some of them, but they were stuff like she loved the crossword puzzle, and she liked to plant flowers. It wasn't like very rich, like stuff that was fodder for a novel. There were a couple cute little stories that were told that I folded into the story and the novel, but most of it was more kind of like surface level. My grandmother, she wasn't an embellisher that much. And
had
so
to dramatize it a little bit.
No, I think there's like stories of the land run kind of in general that people would tell, and I think there's like the kind of frontier Western kind of mythos, like what was the Wild West like, and that is pretty prevalent, and that was kind of fun to play with the idea of like the frontier, and to kind of put like center a woman first and foremost, and also to kind of play with that kind of glossing over it, making kind of like this grand to push at that that idea of the Wild West. So
that's great. Well, let's go to Natasha. Tell us about Aria Jones and the Chateau Marmont. Uh, I'm not sure how to pronounce.
Yep.
And why did you choose that setting?
So I've always been fascinated by the Chateau Marmont. I knew that most of Hollywood stars have lived there at some point in their lives, particularly over the golden age of Hollywood. And it wasn't until I stumbled upon an article about some of those stars and the kinds of things they got up to at the hotel that I realized it was the perfect setting for a story. So, one of the lines in that article that most stood out to me was something that then Columbia Pictures studio president Harry Cohen said in the 1930s. And he said, if you must get into trouble, do it at the Chateau Marmont. And of course, that kind of line is like catnip to a novelist. We immediately start imagining what kinds of trouble our characters could get up to if we placed them in that environment. And the reason he said that was because he had some stars that he had to look after as part of his studio. And they were Glenn Ford, William Holden, and Errol Flynn. So, three not particularly well behaved young men. And of course, at that time in Hollywood, all stars had a morality clause in their contract. So they were meant to behave. Otherwise, they were in danger of losing their contracts. And so, what these three young men were getting up to was starting to find its way into the media, which meant Harry Cohen was in danger of losing his three biggest stars. So, he needed to solve this problem. And his solution was to pay for a suite for them at a hotel that was at that time right out in the wild west of Hollywood. It was right on the fringes, on the edge of Hollywood. He thought if he put them that far out of town, whatever they got up to in that suite that he would pay for wouldn't make its way back to the media. So that's what he did. He put them up there. Humphrey Bogart joined them a few days later, as did a few other male stars of Hollywood. And the plan worked. Nothing about what they did in that suite ever found its way into the media. So from that moment on, it became known as the place where you could go and do whatever you liked and nobody would ever find out about it. And some of those stories have leaked out over the years, and I've used some of those stories as inspiration for some of the things my characters get up to in the book. So, for example, Grace Kelly lived at the hotel when she first arrived in Hollywood, and she would wait in the lobby every day, dressed immaculately from head to toe with her long white gloves on, looking as innocent as all get out. And she'd be examining carefully everybody as they checked into the hotel. And every time a really hot guy checked in, she would go up to the switchboard operator who she'd befriended for this purpose and ask for his room number. And then she'd hop into the elevator, get up to his room as quickly as she could, knock on his door, and introduce herself to this particularly attractive young man. And I'll leave you to imagine what then transpired after that. You had people like Vivian Lee living there while she was separating from her husband, Laurence Olivier, and she was absolutely devastated at this time. She adored Laurence, did not want to separate from him. And the staff estimate she had about 300 photographs of Laurence in her suite at the Marmont, except in her bedroom, where she had the staff take down all of the Marmont's artwork and replace it with her own personal collection of Renoir paintings. So, as you do when you're living in a suite at the Marmont, you bring your own museum-worthy collection of art with you. So you have all these really funny stories, and I've included a lot of those in there. But the more I dug into the research, the more I realized that if a place exists where it's known that you can go and get into whatever trouble you like, then there's a darker side to that. And that darker side usually involves women, and it involves a lot of the Hollywood starlets who arrived at the Marmont thinking their dreams were about to come true. And I realised that this was really the genesis of what we found out during Me Too in 2017. It all began there at the Marmont because of that policy of things not escaping and making their way into the media. So I wanted to write those stories about those women who have given us hopes and dreams and fantasies on the screen, who are single-handedly responsible for movies becoming the cultural phenomenon that they are today, but whose stories we know nothing about. We don't know about their daily struggles, what they had to do behind the scenes to provide us with those beautiful, epic, sweeping stories that we know and love.
So is Aria Jones your protagonist? Is she a fictionalized version of one of these starlets?
So she's a fictionalized version of contemporary Jane Eyre in the 1950s, 1960s, and she's observing all of these things through quite young eyes, 14 when she begins. She becomes a young woman in her early 20s as the book evolves. And I wanted to put an ordinary girl into that environment to see things through her eyes, because I think if you analyze some of those things through the eyes of someone who's already in the Hollywood studio system, they have a very different perspective on it. But an outsider can stand back and understand the darker undercurrent that is running under some of these things that seem funny and fabulous on the surface.
Well, just a lot of fascinating things going on there and a lot to talk about. So we'll come back to find out more about some of those elements. But let's go to Olesya. Tell us more about Zena and her grandmother Olya, and I'm particularly interested in the supernatural elements of this novel.
It's really hard to follow all you ladies. Such fascinating histories and situations. But anyways, yes. So Zena and her grandmother, as I said, they own a tea room. It's a tea room by day, and it is a fortune-telling shop and seance parlor by night. And they mostly cater to the Russian immigrant community, the ladies especially, because historically, women were the ones that would seek out fortune tellers. And that is just something that was very fascinating to me, just because men would frequently be very questioning about supernatural anything, especially in Russia. And so, what I wanted to do with both of them was to sort of explore Slavic fortune telling. And especially very interesting to me was when I started doing the research into it. First of all, Russia has a very, very old tradition of fortune telling. It reaches back hundreds of years. And what was really fascinating about it is I started to recognize things that the women of my family have done that I never really thought about as fortune telling. It was just so, it was never called that. And it was just, it was sort of, this is what we do. Yeah, yeah. You know, I'm going to read your palm when you get home from school. I'm going to have an herb garden in the middle of Moscow because why not? And so that's why the grandmother in my story has a little herb garden in the middle of Paris. And it was just so normal to me that I never questioned it. And so I wanted, especially the grandmother in the story, who's inspired by my grandmother, to kind of have that ability. And I kind of explored different methods of fortune telling. She would do fortune telling through coffee, because actually tea leaves were not done in Russian fortune telling, because you use a samovar for making tea, and there's not that many tea leaves left at the bottom of a cup. And so the interesting part, though, is that economically, it was very strange that fortune telling was done through coffee grinds or coffee, because it was very expensive. And so that's kind of another theme in the book, is this kind of status differences between the characters, you know, where you have my fortune tellers, which are, you know, ordinary people that immigrated to Paris way before the revolution. And then, of course, you have the Romanovs and different princes and the more kind of nobles that escaped the revolution. And so going back to fortune telling, so I wanted my grandmother to have kind of an eye to the future. And so that's kind of why I had her do one of kind of the more, I guess, popular methods of fortune telling. Zena, though, I wanted to be different from her grandmother. I wanted her to be kind of like me, where I'm so sometimes focused on the past, especially with the pandemic, especially losing my grandparents, especially being an immigrant and being very far away from my family. I was very inspired by the spiritualist movement in history. So this kind of started in the US and UK, started in the US with a couple of teenage girls, and it kind of progressed to a whole movement to Europe, to Russia, and other places. And so I wanted to focus on seances. And so I was very much inspired by seances that would be done historically by mostly women, some men though. And so that's kind of their powers. And the event that changes everything is the beginning, where a Romanov princess, who is actually fictional, but she is based on a real Russian princess, Romanov princess, and her brother arrive in Paris, and they want to know what happened to their father, who died many years ago, also in Paris. And so Zina, who actually to this point thinks that she can't do seances because her grandmother does fake seances for money, a struggle of an immigrant. And so she is very shocked to learn that, oh, actually, she can do real seances. She can summon a real spirit. And this spirit is actually not that nice. He's actually vengeful. And he starts to haunt their tea shop and also whisper about the mysterious way her mother died, also in Paris 20 years before. So it's kind of the event that starts everything, her power, her her learning herself, her power, just as a woman, as a fortune teller, as a medium. And I think that's, does that answer your question?
Yes, I love how you're kind of able to connect yourself to Xena. Do any of those fortune telling background, has that made its way to you, and are you passing that along as well? Do you practice any of those cultural things?
Not really, actually, but I guess I'm very superstitious, so I think that's definitely being passed down. Is the superstition is just out of control. I mean, just had like a little family issue, and basically I'm like, we have to, sprinkle holy water everywhere, we have to wear these amulets. I mean, I definitely do that. And regarding fortune telling, who knows, maybe I feel like with age I'm becoming more and more like retrospective and kind of thinking about my family in the past, and therefore this book. And so maybe with the next book it will happen.
Maybe. Well, let's first of all, these books all sound amazing, and we've had some people in the comments saying as much. So I'm going to post that link again to the landing page if you want to find out more about each one of these authors' books. Let's go back to Mar. You told us about Malta and the history a little bit, but you didn't mention anything about your characters. So can you tell us a little bit about the siblings Dominicus and Katrina Montessa and how you use them to tell this story?
Absolutely. So Dom and Kat are siblings, and they're growing up in Malta during this time of rising tension from without and within. Like I said, Corsair raids, the Inquisition, scarcity, famine, illness, feuding rulers, class struggle, all of it, all concentrated on this tiny island. And so Dom is the older brother, Kat is the younger sister. They lose their mom early on, and their dad, despite being a 16th century man, he's fairly progressive. I actually based a little bit of Augustine, their father, on my own dad, who, for a Maltese man who was raised in the 40s, was also quite progressive. My father, I always say he was a feminist and didn't know it. But anyway, so Dom, he carries this really strong sense of duty and honor, and he starts off really, I guess, idealistic. He thinks the knights hung the moon. He's all about, valor and all of that. Kat, on the other hand, is fiercely independent, and she's really intelligent. She's really sharp. She questions everything. She challenges the expectations that are placed on girls and women in the era. And they do have a very strong bond, the siblings. So the reason I chose to tell the story through the siblings is because family relationships are intimate and they're relatable. I'm one of five siblings. So, I can draw a lot from that. I'm the youngest by a massive gap. My siblings are 1 year apart each. The four of them were clustered, and then there was this 12-year gap, and then I came along. My mom swears that it wasn't an oops. I'm an adult and I can handle that it probably was, but she swears up and down I wasn't an oops. Anyways, so I can draw from my own familial experiences. And I just find, through the siblings, readers are able to not just see kind of the grand political conflict or maybe brush up against, known historical figures, but the readers can feel how these broader situations actually affect things like loyalty, faith, identity, and love at the household level. So my goal in using the siblings to tell the story was to make a really complex historical moment feel more emotionally accessible. I just find also that when readers can connect to characters first, history becomes lived rather than distant, rather than this thing that happened, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. In fact, I find history actually becomes incidental. The setting is incidental because the story lives with the characters. And, using siblings to tell that story, I found was like really effective. And it was personal because I infused quite a bit of my own personality into Katrina. So.
Well, I think that's just an excellent definition for historical fiction in general, is that, the setting is incidental. You want to bring people into this place and let them feel what happened. So I think that's wonderful. Laura, we touched on your research a little bit, but I'm curious to know more about that process for you. In Minnesota, we have a lot of, where I live, we have a lot of settler stories, and I have books of them, their journal entries, and you can get so much information about those experiences. What did you rely on for your research in 1893 Oklahoma, and like how much of it did you have to just leave on the cutting room floor? Because I'm sure you must have come across so many interesting stories.
Yes, I think a lot was left on the cutting room floor, and that's a great question. There was just a wealth of stories, and I did actually read a lot of stories. Like there was a lot of North Dakota settlers, and I was really interested in women's stories as well, like their experience. And I was very curious about like kind of I love the character, like the mood, the emotion, like what was behind it. So I didn't read just Oklahoma. I read homesteading stories across the country, and so I read mostly. I did a lot of research, obviously, but my favorite was to read the interviews or the first person accounts, and there was just like thousands. So I would just read those, and I did get great details. Like I read one woman, she would carry cayenne pepper, like she had a 6-shooter, and then she also had cayenne pepper for safety. And I was like, that is super fascinating. Like, early pepper stories, I was like, well, I have to use that. So I do use it. It's chapter 5. And so I think there was just like all these great details. And also you can kind of, if you read a bunch of stories and see what people do, like you see like there's a kind of common thread, but then I'd be like, someone would do something a little different. Like that was a little smarter. So I could steal that and make my character seem very smart. So you could just kind of figure out like, what was the common thing to do? What did oh, that's a really interesting thing someone did. Let me thread that in. So it was very fun to have so many stories, and they're all like a page or two. And so I did that. That was the majority of my most favorite research, was just to read account after account after account. And I did filter in little details and weave them into the story. And a lot was left on the cutting room floor. There was so many that was, you had to cut your darlings. Like this is a really, really fascinating, interesting historical fact, but it doesn't really serve the story. It doesn't serve my character. I remember there was one person that carried, I forget where they carried like extra money. It was a really cool place. It was in some saddle. And I was like, I need to use that, but it never fit. Like I was like, it showed intelligence. And so I wanted to use it, but it just really didn't suit my character story. So I had to cut it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but most of the research was in a lot of photographs. There's a lot of photographs, and I actually like ancient history. So my first novel was ancient. And so it's so wonderful to have like a lot to dig into. It felt very rich, the historical archive.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine must have been very tempting to try and want to use some of those details, and we're like, oh shoot, it doesn't quite work.
I think sometimes as you edit, you kind of forget. Like you had to get used to, like, I don't know, like you kind of get used to cutting. So but I think I'm sure there was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor. That was kind of, yeah.
Can I just ask, your bookshelf is amazing. Is it color coded?
Yes, it is. Someone else brought up COVID. It was a COVID. I had a newborn in COVID. It was a COVID like I took everything down and did it in one day, but I kept it. I like it.
Yeah,
So.
that's amazing. Natasha, let's talk about you mentioned this is related to Jane Eyre. How much did you rely on like the style of Jane Eyre, the format, and why did you decide to use that?
So I wanted to write the book so that it didn't matter if you'd never read Jane Eyre, you could still enjoy the book as a standalone. So in the way that Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead is inspired by Dickens' David Copperfield, or Anne Napolitano's Hello Beautiful is inspired by Little Women. If you know the classics, you feel this beautiful resonance in those contemporary retellings. But if you don't, you can still enjoy the characters and the story. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I first read Jane Eyre when I was 10. I used to go to the library every week and check out as many books as I could on my library card. And when you've been doing that every week of your life up until the age of 10, you make your way through the Enid Blytons and the pony books and the Chalet schoolgirls quite quickly. And the librarian wouldn't let me into the adult section of the library until I was 12. So I had 2 more years to pass in the children's section. And so, as all 10-year-olds do, I decided I'd start reading the classics because I figured there were enough of those to keep me going for 2 years. And it just so happened that the first one I stumbled upon that day was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And I can still vividly remember the cover of that edition that I checked out. More than half of the front cover is taken up by Rochester on his white horse. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner is this teeny tiny little woman called Jane. So the woman whose name is on the front cover of the book was in fact the smallest thing on the front cover of the book, which is ironic because people call Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre the first feminist novel for a reason, but it clearly was not reflected in the cover. You know, if you've read the book, who can forget Jane boldly declaring to Rochester that she's his equal? And this is the mid 19th century. You know, women were not considered to be the equal of a man in the mid 19th century. And even more remarkably, he agrees, which for a man in the mid 19th century is revolutionary. So I wanted to draw on some of those things, but it was rereading the book as an adult that I realized that the things that had really stayed with me from my sort of childhood reading of that were the really dark Gothic things. So the mad woman in the attic, that was a mind-blowing concept that I had never come across in any of my pony books that I had been reading. You know, there was fires and stabbings and Jane's best friend, Helen Burns, dying tragically of consumption. And those were the things that had stayed with me more so than Jane. But rereading the book as an adult, she was the thing that I was most attracted to, this bold, brave feminist heroine. But when I was rereading the book as an adult, what I also noticed was how many times throughout the book, Jane is standing in the grounds of Lowood School, the charity school where she as an orphan is educated, or on the roof of Thornfield Hall, Rochester's property, and she's looking out at the hills that form a barrier between her and the rest of the world. And she yearns and she longs, and that's the language that Bronte uses, to cross over those hills and experience the wide world beyond that, to have adventures, to travel, to do more than remain in this tiny corner of the world that's all she's allowed to access as a poor orphan reliant on the charity of others. When we meet Jane on the first page of the book, she's reading a book about birds, birds from Siberia, birds from the Arctic, and she dreams of what it would be like to fly like the bird to these faraway places. And there's only one moment in the book where she goes a little bit beyond the hills. It's when she runs away from Thornfield after the discovery of Rochester's wife in the attic. And she runs across a moor, as you do when you're in a Bronte novel. That's almost compulsory. And she ends up at the house of this other man who's even more deranged than Rochester is. So she quickly runs back to Thornfield. And, you know, it's no spoiler to say that Rita, she marries him and she lives happily ever after. But I wondered when rereading the book as an adult, if Jane ever not regretted marrying Rochester, because it was a very romantically satisfying ending. I was completely delighted with that as a 10-year-old. But I wondered if she ever regretted not having ventured beyond those hills that she so longed to cross over and not having those adventures that she so yearned to have. So, what I've done in my book is use some of those hallmarks of the story, but I feel like what I've tried to do is shift that a little bit to give Jane the ending that I feel that this bold, brave feminist heroine truly deserves, one that's both romantically satisfying and, more importantly, personally satisfying for her as well.
That's just such an inspiring story from beginning to end. You're certainly a much more advanced reader than I ever was at that age. And just this idea that as authors, like if you want something to exist in the world, you can make it happen. So I think that's really wonderful. Olesya, let's go back to you. I want to know about your genre, which is defined as speculative Gothic suspense and other dark fiction. Tell me about what interests you in that. Well, could you define it maybe for us, and what's compelling about it for you?
Yeah, basically I made that up because for those of us writing in multiple genres, it is very hard to classify us, and by both the publisher, the bookseller, and everyone else. And essentially, we're just masochists that I don't know why we do this. um, Truly, I mean, I think it's a great genre. So the way I define it is I write Gothic fiction, dark fiction, with speculative elements. So fantasy, horror, and of course the historical fiction element as well. So, for example, my first book, which was my debut, it was The Witch and the Tsar, which was a reimagining of the Slavic witch of legend Baba Yaga, if you've heard of her. So it was a lot more fantastical, and but it was still very much dark fiction. And then since then, I've kind of transitioned into this. I guess the easiest way to say it is like Gothic horror, but I'm not quite horror. I'm more. I would say, yeah, historical Gothic fiction, Gothic suspense with some horror elements, some fantasy elements, and some mystery elements. So I mean, honestly, I'm just drawn to it because I was a lawyer in my former life, and I love complicating the hell out of everything. I love working on a puzzle. It reminds me when I worked on these 80, 90 page, 120 page briefs. And basically but it's more fun. So I feel like I can actually use my legal degree. And it really is like working on a puzzle. Putting all these elements together into a coherent story is the challenge. And for me, I just get bored with the same thing. If I would be writing the same thing over and over again, I would gouge my eyes out. I love changing things up, and that's why I changed time periods. I love using different fantastical horror elements in my different books, and it just keeps things interesting for me. So yeah, I think that's how I would describe what I do in the little corner of what I do.
I'm curious, has any of your manuscripts ever gotten too complicated? Maybe like a fishing line you couldn't untangle, and you're like, shoot, I gotta move on to something else.
Yeah.
No, actually no, but I have had moments where so okay, so every manuscript I write, I have this horrific moment about, I'd say 75 to 150 pages in, where it is very bad to be in my house. I mean, it is just drama. It is not, nothing is working. And so nothing is working in my house. So um, I feel like I need those moments because it gets me closer to the story that I want to tell. In terms of overcomplicating, I think with my so I'm on my third book now. Fortune Tellers of Ruderay was my third book, and with my first one, that was, I think, too complicated for me, and it was my first book. It was, I had moments. I remember my editor gave me 8 weeks to completely rewrite the book. And at that point, and it was over Christmas. And so I had moments where I don't think I can do this because I don't think I can figure out what she wants me to do, because editors are very, this would be so nice. Do you know how to do this? No, but I'm sure you will figure it out. Okay. And so that I had moments where it was very, I could not figure it out, or I could not, continue. And at the end of the day, I did figure it out, and I did continue, and I did write the best book that I could at that time. And it's interesting because looking at, my second book was different issues, but kind of also, I feel like I did too complicated. And I feel like I think it's my favorite book of mine. But I think it was the hardest experience I've ever had, just because the history was difficult. It was very emotional. It was the pandemic. And it was just all the elements were really, I could not figure out how to connect everything. And with this third one, honestly, it was easy. Just because I think everything just made sense to me. And honestly, I think it's because I really simplified. I really simplified my storylines. I simplified my characters, and I kind of focused my writing a lot more. So I think it's a continual process. I'm continually learning, and I think that's why I really love this genre. Is that it's never boring. It's always exciting, and I'm always learning.
Well, good for you for working through those challenges, and yeah, now you're a better writer because of it. Well, I've
I
got
hope
plenty.
so.
Yeah. I have plenty more questions for our panelists. If anyone in our audience has a question, you can raise your hand. You can post it in the chat. I'm happy to facilitate that. I do want to ask Mar, your Eight-Pointed Cross is being republished. Tell us how that came about.
So the first edition was published in 2011, and I was at the beginning of my journey as a novelist, and over the years I evolved. And I also, I think I'd mentioned during our pre-chat that I became a professional editor. So I reread my first book with this like really critical lens, the way I would read a manuscript that I was working on for a client. And it was a little painful. Bear in mind, I wrote that first novel when I was 23. So like I said, I evolved. Having a new publishing house sign me, it gave me the opportunity to really kind of dig in and refine the prose and strengthen certain passages and just ensure that the novel now better reflected the writer I've become, or hope I've become. It allowed me to present the story in a way that kind of aligned more fully with my long-term vision for the entire trilogy. And also, I have been working on a prequel that is set about 20 years before the Eight-Pointed Cross is set, actually 40 years before, because before the Knights of St. John ended up taking over Malta. Well, they were handed Malta, I should say. Again, without the consent of the Maltese, they were just given Malta for a rent of, I think it was something like 3 falcons a year to the King of Spain. They got Malta. But this came after they were kicked out of Rhodes by the Ottoman Empire. And so I've started working on a prequel that is set in Rhodes. And there are certain elements in that prequel that I felt almost handcuffed, like I can't write this because this doesn't happen in Eight-Pointed Cross. So, but because I was given the opportunity to do like this massive revision, I could actually go in and like add a few scenes so that I can make things happen in the prequel that I otherwise would have been, limited by the actual plot and structure of Eight-Pointed Cross. But because I had this freedom now, I could go back and make a few changes so that I could have the prequel flow the way that I wanted it to, include the elements that I really wanted it to have. So that was wonderful as well. Ultimately, it wasn't about rewriting the heart of the story. That's remained intact. It was about polishing Eight-Pointed Cross so that it can stand confidently beside it's book siblings, because the other two, the second book, Falcon's Shadow, and then the third one, Ashfall, I wrote those when I was older. Like Falcon's Shadow, I wrote when I was in my mid 30s. So I was more mature as a writer, maybe less idealistic. And I felt like Eight Pointed Cross wasn't measuring up to Falcon's Shadow or Ashfall. And so having the opportunity to tighten it and so that it would look pretty beside its siblings, I was really happy I had that opportunity.
I think that definitely relates to what Olesya was saying. You learn as a writer. I can certainly say the same thing. I wrote my first manuscript 15 years ago, and I can't imagine diving back in, and it would just be so cringy almost, but good for you for working through that and making it something even better. We do have a question about the publishing process. I'm going to ask Laura. Laura, this is your debut, correct?
Yes,
Do you
it
want
is.
to tell us a little bit about that experience and what you recommend for others who might be nearing that stage in their writing career?
Yes. Someone also asked, like, they were asking about questions about time and agents. So I think I might pull a couple of questions together. This is the first book I published, but I've written other ones. And my first book I started in 2006. So it's 20 years from starting writing a historical novel to publishing, and very long journey. I was reading, it wasn't like I stopped. And I think so someone asked what route would you choose for going through an agent or self-publishing, and I think there's pros and cons to both, and I just really wanted to traditional publish, and that was just kind of the goal, and I'm happy with it now because I feel like I had all those years to hone my craft, and I have all those years that I'm very proud of my debut, and I think I've actually really loved the other ones as well. But I think it's also, you have to like look at your everyone has their own path, everyone has their own career. And it really works for like my life. I'm very happy with looking at it, how it all played out. So your question was querying. What was your question was about how it was to be a debut. As a debut, I had a great experience. I think getting to a deal was brutal and awful and very hard. So if anyone's in the query trenches, I've been there, and it was like debilitating. Like it was very hard, and I had to continually remind myself, like, why do I write? Why am I doing this? Where do I find the joy? And so I think it was also good for me, I think, to have gone through that. So now I have a lot of fun. Like I'm very, very happy and very thankful, and I just really enjoy it. But then once I queried this novel, that all went very well, and querying went really well. And since I've had my deal, it's just been a blast. Like I love my imprint. I found the great team. I think it just took a long time to find kind of my team, but I've been very, very happy. Not just saying that because it's like public. I'm extremely happy with my imprint, and it's been pretty much the experience of debuting has been very fun. There's so many things you don't like. I feel like confused a lot, and I don't know what I'm doing, and like there's a lot of there's so many little pieces you have to do, but it's been like a lot of fun. So the experience was to getting a publishing deal was hard, but since then it's been just a blast. So.
Yeah, well, congratulations on sticking through that process.
Yes.
That's very
that's
inspiring.
I think it's such a personal decision. Someone asked like what to do. Is like, I think you have to figure out what's important to you. And for me, I just knew that self-publishing was not a route that I really thought would be a good fit for me. For a variety of reasons. It just wasn't a good fit for me personally. I ran a business at one point. I didn't really enjoy it. And you kind of run a business if you're self-published. And so I didn't think it was a good fit for me. And I just really wanted to be part of a team and collaborative. And it's also just really good to always think about like, why do you do it? What's important to you? And I would like literally write down like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I still, why am I not giving up? But and I think that was very good for me to simplify it and to really write for the love of writing. I think that also with this one, because I had experienced rejection, I was like, I'm just going to write the story I want to write. And I played around a lot. I think that kind of life probably is in the story some. So.
Once again, just congratulations on sticking through that. And it's even better to say, you know what, I'm just going to write what I want to write. And it worked out for you. That's great.
Yeah.
Natasha, we had a question about, it was from Leslie. Each one of the other panelists has mentioned, I put myself in this in some way, or my family's in this. Does that happen to you at all, where you insert yourself in some way or your personality into the novels?
Yeah, so I actually feel like this one is probably my most personal novel in terms of the main character, Aria, who, as I said, begins the novel. She's not quite 14 years old. And I wanted to write about, in my previous novels, I've written about women who are obvious heroines. So my last novel, The Mademoiselle Alliance, was about the only woman to lead a French resistance network during the Second World War, Marie Madeleine Fourcade, who, escaped from prison by squeezing her body out through the bars of a jail cell and folded herself double into a mailbag to smuggle herself across a border for 10 hours. So, they were obvious heroines. But I wanted to, in this book, take someone who was a completely ordinary person and see what it would take for them to become a heroine of their story. And so I was thinking about what life was like for me as a 14-year-old when I began writing Aria's character. And one of the things that most vividly has stuck with me is I was quite academically gifted as a teenager, and I would always get the highest marks in all of my subjects in high school. And when I was going through high school, that was not particularly valued. I'm not sure what word you guys used in the US, but if you were the smart person in your high school in Australia, you were a square or a nerd. And so that was me. And I remember very vividly when I was 14, trying to get some questions wrong in a math test, just so my mark wouldn't be quite as high. It would be more, ordinary, more a part of the same kind of marks that everybody else or grades that everybody else was getting for their tests. And, looking back on that, I think, wow, in what kind of world do you grow up thinking that it's better to be less smart than you really are? And I feel like it's almost a universal experience that everybody has at some points or another. I'm not sure whether it's just women or it's probably men as well, felt that they've had to be smaller than or lesser than, less smart, less loud, less obvious, dress differently, change themselves to become a smaller person in a certain environment, whether that's at high school or at a job or in a social situation or in a family situation. I feel like most people go through that. And so I really wanted to draw on that in this book and see, well, what does it take for that person who has learned to be small and invisible? What does it take for them to stand up and go, no, it's time for me to be the star of my own life? So in that way, this book is very personal to me.
Well, I'm sorry you experienced that. I can't imagine. I'm very competitive. I was always trying to, I wanted to get 100% on everything. But I think that's wonderful just to hear you learn from that and put that in your novel. Well, we've got to wrap things up. This went so quick. I want to thank our audience who's been really engaged this whole time. So that's really nice. But our hour is up, and I know people have other things to do. So we're going to wrap up. I do want to remind everyone that you can pick up these books at that landing page there that I posted. If you get them through bookshop.org, those give money back to independent booksellers. If you can't buy their books right now, request them at their library, even just like putting in a purchase request if they don't have the books. That helps a ton. Or just telling your friends about them. Anything helps support these authors and all the work that they've done, all the years and years of labor they put into these really amazing stories that bring out some very important history. So I always end the panel with, well, and thank you to our panelists. This has been wonderful. I always ask, why historical fiction? What's the value? Because all of you are writing about history that could be shared through, nonfiction texts. But what's the value of fictionalizing history through, historical fiction? Mark, could you start us off?
Sure. I think historical fiction gives the past a face. It gives it a heartbeat. It creates empathy in readers. It takes events that maybe seem dry in a textbook, and it makes them personal, and it makes you care about what happened. There is a misconception. I've said this before, but there's a misconception that fiction is the opposite of truth, and I don't think that that's true. I think so much truth can exist in fiction, and I think our job as historical fiction writers is to give the past a face and to create empathy. and to teach, but to teach in a way that almost tricks the reader into learning, kind of like when you, I don't know, when you're feeding a child and you pretend it's an airplane and they eat the healthy food because they're being tricked into eating the healthy food. I kind of feel like we can do that as historical fiction writers. We can teach, but we're not forcing the lesson. We're teaching through the gaining of empathy and giving the past a heartbeat and a face.
I never thought of it that way, but that's a very good illustration. Laura, how about you, the value of historical
I
fiction?
really like that, Maud. That was really great. I think I'm really interested in the similarities and differences. I'm just so curious about women in the past. I'm always drawn to it because I don't think they're that much different. I think that they're still women. If it's a woman in 1890s or the 1500s, they still have hopes, desires, fears, like pain. And so I'm very drawn to, I just always been super curious about like women in the past. I think for me, it's the same questions, like empathy, the same things that we're struggling with in our own life, they're struggling with back then. So that's just what's interesting to me. I think for me, the most fun part of my book, like she goes through like a really like a hard journey. She goes through, I think it sounds like all of our books, they have really hard things they go through, but they endure. And so I think for me, it's 1890s, but it's still relatable to the struggles we have in our own life. And so I think it's kind of fun to like disappear from the world a bit and just travel along someone else and hopefully be encouraged. And that's kind of why I'm drawn to write historical fiction. I think it doesn't really, I think any genre, it'd be kind of the same thing because I'm a character driven novelist. It's like whatever, if I plot my character in, a fantasy world, I think I'd still be kind of hoping to have the reader leave with a similar experience. But I think I guess the reason I like historical specifically is it's just I guess it is again to shine a light on like uncovered hidden stories. Like it's kind of a common overall about women that are at the fringes or stories that we don't know. There's a lot like that we don't know, just to shine a light on what has been overlooked.
Yeah, for sure. Natasha, how about you, the value of historical fiction?
Yeah, I agree with what Ma and Laura have said. I think writing historical fiction is all about showing the reader how far we've come in so many ways, but also how far we still have to go. So if you're reading about some of these stories of these women in Hollywood from the 1950s, you might think, okay, wow, those things we don't have to do anymore. But actually, wow, some of this stuff still goes on. So it's that contrast between movement, but a lack of progress in some ways as well. And also, I believe that, the beauty of historical fiction is, let's take something like The Tower of London, for example. A non-fiction book can tell you the date it was completed, when it was started, what materials were used, how many people were involved in the construction. But a historical novel will tell you what it felt like to be the guy who put the last brick into that tower. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, really bringing that to life. Finally, Olesya, what do you think is the value of historical fiction?
Again, this is very hard to follow. I agree with everything that has been said. I think to me, the best thing about historical fiction is focusing on the stories that aren't in those history books. It's the stories where people turn to me and they're like, I know 1920s Paris, but I don't know about this small immigrant community that lived in 1920s Paris that was basically created on the shoulders of women. And so that's what I love doing, is I love finding areas of history, pockets of history, especially focusing on women as the other panelists, and giving them a voice that they may not have had in the history books. And it's also fun, it's immersive, and it's, on the other hand, a mirror to the world we live in. And it kind of takes all the issues that we're seeing now and it distills it through this historical safe lens. And it's just, yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's immersive and fun and just a ball.
Very well said. And thanks again to our panelists. I really admire the work that you do. I'm so glad I could bring you on this panel and we could talk about your work. So just keep doing what you're doing. Thanks to our audience for joining us. We are returning May 31st with another panel. It'll be a noon central panel. So hopefully you can join us for that. Well, have a good day wherever you are, and we'll see you next time on What's New in Historical Fiction.
Thank you.